Okay, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. I think we've just got a few more people joining, but we'll get going now to keep on time. Welcome to our Christmas Lunch and Learn, or our December 2025 Lunch and Learn. This is the 8th this year. We started in April, and it's just amazing to have so many of you here, and thank you for your support. There's a couple of things I just want to kick off with to start, just sort of housekeeping issues. The first one is just to say we are recording this session. And it will be going onto our YouTube channel. And for those of you that have joined us before, we published that link out so you can watch it back, share it with your friends, do whatever you want with it. But please do promote it on our Building Safety Register YouTube channel. A big thank you to all of you for coming and supporting this series, which we started off in April, as I said, and we didn't know whether we'd get one attendee or 100 or 1,000 or whatever. It's been absolutely brilliant. We've normally sort of averaged about 60 to 70 per live audience per event. And also thank you to all of my different guests that we've had over that period of time. So we've got, and I'll take you through them in a minute, all but 2 of our expert guests have managed to make it to today, to come and join us again for this look back over 2025. And also, more importantly, I think, pick their brains about what they think is going to happen in 2026. Before we get going on that, I just wanted to make a nod to and just take a moment and a pause to think about the as yet counted 159 fatalities in Hong Kong last week. And I won't pronounce the name of the building because I'll get it wrong. But 159 people are now confirmed at the latest count as being lost in that tragedy, including 1 firefighter, as far as I'm aware. And also, at the point, looking at that this morning, getting the numbers that there were, I think there's been 13 arrests so far over that incident. But one of them apparently is a student, a guy called Miles Kwan, who's been arrested for launching a petition calling for victim support and accountability. So I think, as we look back at Grenfell and we look at the way that residents were treated there and what happened, just to think in somewhere like Hong Kong that, you know, some of the things that people on this call have been involved in, and I've certainly been involved in terms of trying to hold people to account and call out bad practice. In somewhere like Hong Kong, you can still be arrested for that type of activism work. So just a thought there for Miles, if that's the true story. The other key point on that I just wanted to mention is that with Hong Kong and how it relates to here, is that it would appear that in Hong Kong, the scaffolding around that building could well have played a major part in that fire spread. I think that's being conservative in my language. It obviously did. But closer to home, we have the Spectrum building fire in Dagenham, which was in August 2024, which was a scaffolded remediation project with residents living in that building. And as yet, sort of well over a year later, the incident report has still not been published for that fire, and maybe that's something we'll touch on with the group later on. But you know, it's not to say, you know, it wasn't a bamboo scaffold, it was a timber plank scaffold, but they were scaffolded buildings going through remediation. And really, I think one of the questions is, what can we learn from that? What information can we share, and how can we try and avoid the third one going, if you see what I mean? So that's just on the intro. As I say, we've been through a number of these now, going back to April. So we had Steve first, where we talked about building safety information at scale back in our first one of these that we did. We then went into, with Sue Butcher, who can't be here today, more of a deeper dive into the golden thread of building safety information, and was that a realistic goal? With Chris Waterman, who's a policy advisor, who again, unfortunately, has had to cry after this, had to go to a funeral. But we talked about the legislation side of this, the plethora of building regulations and secondary statutory instruments and primary legislation and guidance and all those other things that we're bombarded with working in this sector. We then had a bit of a reflection, a slightly strange one, where in July, the Grenfell Uncovered documentary came out on Netflix, and thought it'd be a good idea just to open that up to the audience to talk about what we all thought about that. So we didn't have a guest speaker on that one. It was just the attendees were the guest speakers, because it's, you know, everybody's got a view on it. We then rolled into with James Capper, who's on the call today, talking about the looking back at the Building Safety Act 2022 and sort of saying, well, how's it going so far? What's working? What's not working? What's driving improvement? We then went into Melisa White, who's on the call today, and we talked about evacuations, decants, prohibitions of buildings, and really looking at the impact on residents of living through that kind of process. And Melissa's gone through that herself, or is going through that process herself, as well as working in the industry now. And then we finished off with Simon last month, where we were talking about the data that we've extracted from the Public Register of higher risk buildings. Unfortunately, Simon had an issue with family, so couldn't join us for that one at the last minute, but thankfully he's here today, back in the saddle, so he's on the call today. So that was sort of subjects we covered. We were always looking for topics, and actually when I started this, I didn't know how difficult it would be to actually pin down a topic each month to try and evolve the conversation, but also hopefully talk about something that maybe isn't getting talked about more widely at the moment. So again, anybody watching, please do hit me up anytime with ideas for what we should talk about, because we are going to carry on doing this next year. So that's part of the announcement that's going to come later. So just running through the speakers again, I did mention them on the way in, but we've got Steve Bunce, who hopefully can give us a wave. Steve is a building safety case manager for Lewisham Council. He is responsible for 50-something safety case environments, reports, building assessment certificate applications, etc., and interacting with a large team of building safety managers who are actually doing the work on the ground. So he is absolutely a practitioner of the Building Safety Act. Chris Waterman, who can't be here, unfortunately, he advises Lords and MPs on political policy, but I'll talk to his bit in a minute. But he's got a lot of experience around education and building safety and a whole bunch of other areas in Parliament. James Capper from Wildheart Residential, so technical director, again, like Steve, responsible for a wide portfolio of higher risk buildings, in a slightly different situation, Steve, in the sense that he's working for the principal accountable persons and other people who'll explain that, but ultimately more on the private side, private landlord side, as opposed to the council social landlord side. Melisa from KindStay, again, who is, as I mentioned in the intro, is living through right now a prohibition of her building, her apartment building, but is also providing really unique services into the industry in terms of how to support residents going through remediation projects, decants, etc., which she'll explain, but has really, really useful insights into the human side of the impact of this. And then we have Simon Lay, who is a fire engineer and, excitingly, now a PhD student, diving right into the data in terms of understanding how we quantify risk and how we can model risk, etc., hopefully at the push of a button, as opposed to after £50,000 worth of report writing. So that's where Simon fits into this whole mix. So hopefully that's a good mix of people. Sue Butcher is an expert in sort of digital building information, but unfortunately can't be with us today because she's at something far more exciting in London, but she does send her best wishes, and I said I would speak to her slides. So hopefully that's a good mix of people. And I will also attempt to keep on track, and I'm already behind, so I will move on. And we'll go into the first talk that we had back in April. So some of the things that we were talking about with Steve was around the raft of legislation, so the Building Safety Act, the Fire Safety England regs, the Regulation 38 information and Regulation 38 of the building regs, and the requirements driven by all of those regulations and laws to hold building safety information or building information. And we talked a lot about the scale of this, that there are so many buildings. I mean, we later worked out, which we'll come to in, I think, with the discussion with Simon, that there are 13,827 unique higher risk buildings in England. Each one of these will be accumulating a lot of information about itself and about its maintenance and its management to comply with the legislation that's on the screen there. So we'll come on a bit later to the sort of the numbers that are involved, but it is a huge amount of information about each of the buildings. The requirement for the golden thread, that single source of truth for building information. mandated in the Building Safety Act. We talked a lot about that and the challenges of from a principal accountable person's perspective, or an accountable person's perspective, how hard it is to actually manage this type of information at scale. So in Steve's context, over 50 buildings in that initial scope. Some of the challenges that, building on that a bit more, is that sort of the evidence that you think you've got, or you're sure you have, but you can't necessarily find. It may have been lost to time, it may never have existed. It may be that somebody's telling you that they're doing something, but actually they can't prove that they've done it. That's difficult. You can't put fresh air into a system of truth. The distributed responsibility, we talked a lot about the within a larger organization, the fact that you've got a supply chain of contractors coming in and doing compliance checks. You've got departments doing compliance checks. They may well not be under the direct control of the building safety management team. So their job is to actually bring all of this information together and maintain that golden thread, looking at the building holistically. Expiries and renewals, again, pretty much all of this documentary evidence is coming up against hard stops of 6 monthly renewal or annual renewal, twice every 2 yearly, or whatever it is. So all of that underlying information is currently constantly going out of date and expiring and has to be renewed and replaced. Again, that's a challenge. And then a real big challenge around, we talked about this a lot, around duplication. So an example of that is I may hold my safety case report, for example, in my golden thread. That is my latest version of my safety case report. But under the law, I've got to provide a copy of that to the regulator. So I've already taken a copy of my live document from my golden thread and I've uploaded it to the regulator. Similarly, with evacuation plans or fire door information, whatever, I'm taking that out and I'm uploading it to the local fire services site. So I'm constantly duplicating all of this massive information. Bits of it are being duplicated and uploaded elsewhere. And we talked a lot about that. So what I wanted to do now is bring in Steve and say, Steve, reflecting on what we talked about back in April, what are your thoughts now? Have your views changed, and what do you see happening in 2026? So over to you.
Yeah, hi Matt. No, my views haven't changed. I mean, it's been an interesting year since we've chat in April. I'd like to put in, I mean, we've had confirmation that we're on the right track with what we're actually doing. We've had an audit of our system, the building safety data management system, and we got the top rating of substantial assurance with no identified actions. So in that sense, it gave us the confidence that what we thought we were doing right appears to be working. So we're not saying, yeah, we're there and it's perfect, but we're on the right track. And also since then, we've had the results back on our first 2 back applications, which were submitted in June 2024. And we got the results in October this year. So just under 500 days. And again, we got both of those submitted with, granted with no actions. And that was on the basis of a lot of information that they were asking for up until the date, and only that we all had it to hand straight away in our sort of golden thread that we were able to satisfy them. So again, it was just a reassurance that we believe we're doing right. But again, to me, it's the same problems we've got. It's the fragmented legacy systems. Oh, everybody, the information exists, but it's in siloed teams, different databases. It's everywhere. We're never going to get it all in one place, everyone else putting it there. And the way I liken it is trying to build a jigsaw, but half of the pieces are in other people's boxes. It's all there, but you just can't. So again, that's where we go and collect it and bring it back to this single source. And again, that's where it needs to be validated, because again, the accuracy. Moving forwards, I'm quite confident. Personally, I think from what I've noticed recently, just in some of our assessments that we've got in now, I think the BSR are actually improving, and their assessments are are becoming quicker. The information that they're asking for, it's not as haphazard as before. So I think they've learned a lot of lessons. And what I will say to people is they're good. Some of the bits that they were asking us for, they were asking us for the results of something that was recommended in a report that was undertaken 3 years ago that we submitted. So they delved that deep to actually say, oh, by the way, this should have been done now. Do you have the results of that? Luckily, we did. Well, I say luckily, but because we had carried out, you know, we'd done what we said we were going to do, we had that. But they are looking deep and they will hold you to account of what you've said. So the golden thread has to be consistent and accurate, but it also has to have a history. As you're saying, you know, the safety case reports are always updated and ours are always changing. However, we do still have to be able to access a version of it looking back at a period in time. It's not all about the present. It has to be, you know, you can pick out what's gone on in history so you can show it going back. And I think that's what the BSR are going to be looking at. If anything, I would say the second application of your back is going to be harder than the first because they've already got something to measure you against and what you said you were going to do. So, yeah, they will be looking back more than looking forwards.
Brilliant. Thanks, Steve. That's a really good overview. And what we're going to do is we're going to come back in at the end for questions for the audience. And I've already got questions coming in. So we'll hopefully have enough time to whiz through into that. So thank you for that. Moving on, Sue isn't with us, so I'll just run through what we talked about there with golden thread. So building on what Steve said. So we required under the Building Safety Act 2022. A key overlooked area of the golden thread or content of the golden thread is the keeping and provision of information regulations, which is what enshrines the rights of residents and other parties to information that should sit within the golden thread. They are quite onerous and difficult to meet, but there is little evidence at the moment of people actually asserting their rights. But I think that will come as people get to understand the legislation more. The golden thread attributes, the key ones that we spend a lot of time talking about, is that it needs to be digitally stored. It needs to be secure. It needs to be up to date or kept up to date. And this key one, it needs to be portable. What happens when building A gets sold from one principal accountable person to another? There is a legal requirement now that however you hold that information, it needs to be portable over to the new PAP. That's a legal requirement. And again, that's very difficult to do if you've got all this information enmeshed into your own core systems that you can't extract from or lift and shift over to a new PAP. Again, there's very little evidence at the moment of any kind of enforcement against any kind of breaches of these principles or whatever. But you know, over time, I think, as Steve was mentioning, as the regulator sort of starts to find its feet properly and swat away Gateway 2 delays or whatever it is, I think they will start looking at the occupation phase and the back process in far more detail. And the law is there to back them up to come in 2 years' time and say, well, look, show me how you comply with the whatever part of the act or whatever regulation, and demonstrate that we're coming in to audit you. That kind of activity will probably start. So that was what we talked about with Sue. You've got me for a while, actually, because the next one, Chris, isn't here. So legislation, we talked again in detail about a lot about the Building Safety Act, but also what secondary legislation is, where the guidance comes in, what you have to comply with, and literally the sheer volume of legislation and updates to other acts of parliament that, as a result, I think it was 6 or 7 other acts of parliament that were either referenced or amended by the Building Safety Act 2022. So you do have to spend a lot of time whizzing between different bits of legislation because it will just say, you know, paragraph whatever of the Building Act, and then it doesn't tell you what that is. So you then have to go and look at the Building Act to sort of tie it all together. And how you maintain your competence, your confidence, and your compliance with those regulations. And we talked about a number of ways of doing that, and that included signing up to our 2022 BSA Resource Centre, which is free for everybody to use. I think a lot of people, I updated it this morning with new PEEP guidance, etc. And effectively, that's all the stuff that we've talked about above in one place securely with an invitation to it that will tell you when stuff gets added or updated, and we do that as a sort of a weekly monitor of the new stuff that's been published, and we add it in and everybody gets notified. So if you haven't got an invitation to that, if you want to put something in the chat or send me an email with your email address, or reply to one of our emails, then we can get you added to the resource centre. The trade press, there's a lot of work that goes on in the trade press explaining, blogs and articles around what's going on in the building safety world. The HSE newsletter is, in some cases, quite useful in terms of signposting. It's not particularly frequent and covers a lot of topics, but again, make sure you're signed up to that through the HSE and the BSR. And then obviously the CPD events that are going on. This isn't a CPD event, but it's sort of similar. And also the qualifications like the Level 6 Diploma in Building Safety Management and all the other stuff that's going on through the trade membership bodies related to building safety. So I think there's some really useful stuff out there, but it is really a full-time job just trying to keep up to date with what's going on as this regime rolls out and gets interpreted. The other point I haven't mentioned on there is looking at the latest legal cases. So what's coming out of the first tier tribunal, what's coming out of the civil courts in terms of how various parts of these acts and regulations are interpreted, whether that's roof terraces, mezzanine floors, historical liability, etc. It goes on and on and on. But yeah, for the legal geeks, it's all interesting stuff. Me again, I'm afraid. The Grenfell Uncovered documentary. So hat tip to Rogan Productions. I think they did a great job putting this together for Netflix. I was concerned about it at the start in terms of how they might treat the subject, but I think on balance they treated everybody very fairly. I think they really got across the human impact of the tragedy. Came out in June 2025. What we discussed, so we broke this down into sort of having a look at the human story, so the characters involved, whether it was the residents, whether it was the firefighters that attended, the people that were impacted by the human side of this tragedy. And there's just some amazing people in there, and won't name them all now. We talked about the experts, so Professor Guillermo Rain was on there, and a few other people just trying to explain some of the technicality of what went on. And I don't think it was overly technical. Probably for me, not technical enough, but I probably wasn't the audience that they had in mind. We then had a chat about the villains, or the perceived villains, of which there were many, and they're all still at large. And at some point, I guess we'll understand whether they will actually have charges brought against them or whether this will just go away. But at the moment, as far as I'm aware, no charges have been brought. So at the earliest, it's going to be 2026 before we start seeing some charges. And then we looked at some of the technical aspects that were covered in the production, which I think were in some cases a little bit ill-explained or a bit off. But overall, and the storytelling there, overall, I think it was a really well-produced piece of work. I looked at on Rotten Tomatoes, it got 100%, if that means anything to anyone. But maybe something we'll pick up in the afterwards is did it actually change anything? Did it get the attention that it deserved or the story deserves? And my personal view is not really. Somebody asked a question on LinkedIn yesterday or the day before, saying that charges were being brought quite quickly around the Post Office Horizon scandal 8 years after Grenfell. Why hasn't it happened? And my flippant answer, but I said it for a reason, was that one of those tragedies had a hit drama written about it. The other one hasn't. And the cynic in me says that the public are demanding some action as a result of the Post Office scandal because of the drama, whereas that hasn't happened with Grenfell. So it does just fall down the list, I think, in terms of priorities. I'm hoping I'm wrong, and I'm hoping that actually things will happen and there will be some closure for everybody. Even if that closure is there are no charges to be answered, it will draw a line under it rather than it just dragging out for another year or a year after that. Okay, so on to someone else, so I can let James speak. So Building Safety Act 2022 with James. So we talked in detail about, so this happened just as the management changes were being announced. So that I think from memory, we knew that the regulator was moving from the HSE into the Ministry of Housing. And I think at that time, we just about knew that Andy Rowe and Charlie Pugsley from London Fire Brigade were going in to become the chair and the chief exec, respectively. So we had a chat about what those management changes might bring. We talked, I think, in a bit of detail about the Gateway 2 delays that were getting all of the press attention in terms of this is stopping 1.5 million homes, buildings aren't being built, etc., etc. But we did also dive into the probably underreported aspect of what Gateway 2 delays are doing to remediation projects, and the irony that projects that will be making residents safer are being delayed because of Gateway 2 delays. And hopefully we'll get an update from James in a minute on the latest news on Gateway 2. We talked about the back process of the building assessment certificate, used to be assurance, building assessment certificate process, the bit that Steve was talking about, the existing buildings, of which there's over 13,800 that are being progressively called in for review. And for anyone that isn't doing this all the time, the regulator is calling in the safety case report, the mandatory recurrence reporting system, and the resident engagement strategy, the holy trinity as I call it. And then from that, they review those, and then they come back through a process called RFI, which is a request for information, asking for further information or clarification on those 3 presentations, and underlying evidence to say, as Steve said, you said that in your work programme by X date you would have done Y. Where is evidence of Y being done? They go through multiple iterations of RFI. And at some point in the future, either a refusal notice or a assessment certificate pop out of the end of that process. And that's the process Steve's just been through. James has been through a number, and yeah, various people on the call will have been either in or going through that process. We talked a bit about the technology or the lack of it. And again, I think in the 2026 review, we've got some news on that that's emerging from the regulator. We talked about the charging. So again, for anybody that's not aware, for every hour or quarter of an hour or 10 minutes or whatever that the regulator spends looking at your Gateway 2 application or your back application, whatever it is, or answering a question, the clock is running at £152 an hour, I think it is now, 151, something like that. And it's largely quite haphazard as to what you may or may not get charged for any of those activities and when you get charged. But you will be charged for their time. It's a cost recovery model. And we talked a bit about the Grenfell Inquiry Phase 2 recommendations. So this is one of the key ones here in the context of this, is the potential redefinition of what a higher risk building is. So one of the recommendations in Grenfell 2 was that the government review the definition of an HRB. So that it is unlikely that the definition will lead to an HRB being increased in or decreased in scope, as in the height or floor limit moved up. It might go down or out into something like a lower rise care home, for example, or down to 11 meters, but it probably won't go up. So the scope will either stay the same or it will expand depending on what the government decide. And my understanding is we were meant to hear by the end of this year what the thinking is in relation to that, but I haven't heard anything. So at that point, I will flip over to James for his expert insight into any of that and what 2026 holds.
Yeah, there's I think a couple of those sort of lead into one another. So the management changes at BSR and the shift to NHCLG, I think, leads into that BSR technology piece. Still both fairly challenging as an operator. I think that the technology side of it, the cynic in me says a simple shift across to NHCLG, that all of those HSE emails, everything else now need to be updated, and we need to be sending notifications to different places. So it remains to be seen what that looks like. However, since those changes, I think they're calling it the innovation unit to speed up some of these gateway 2 delays. I think some of you will have seen the data that they're now publishing, which is beneficial to see. In my opinion, I think we're still way too focused on new builds and London rather than the occupied estate and remediation, which is kind of the same position we were in when we spoke earlier in the year. I think if the technology, the resources there within BSR, I'm more concerned about life safety than I am new builds going up. Yes, we've got a housing shortage, but it seems to me, since we spoke, certainly the kind of cards are on the table now. The political will has shifted, and it's quite clear to see that they are trying to do these in bulk for major house builders to reach housing targets, and as a consequence, those gateway 2 applications are not being prioritised in the way they should be for remediation. I think that as we move into 26, we will see that timescale shortened. We'll see the backlog clear, and I think, in all fairness, that's where we'll really see the bad actors run out of excuses. You know, we're seeing programs that have got 52 weeks in at standstill at the moment because of BSR. If BSR get that down to 8 weeks, then all of a sudden people really got to pull their socks up and start delivering these projects and get remediation done. I'm sure Melisa will touch on that as well, the kind of oversight of those projects with Hong Kong, with the Dagenham fire, needs a lot more scrutiny. And if BSR are able to do that, from albeit under CDM regulations really is where it sits, but the actual management of safety risks during remediation, I think the regulator needs to have a handle on as part of that gateway 2. In terms of the back process, similar to Steve, really, I've actually found that the regulatory leads pretty pragmatic. They explain why something hasn't satisfied them and what you need to do to get to that point. I'm in the very fortunate position in terms of my own understanding of BSR that I'm looking at 11 contravention notices on a backward review. So that is everything from resident engagement to structure to fire, or pretty much all of those PAP duties. Since they were issued 6 months ago, we've satisfied 7 of them, I think, and 2 more are in review. And what I found is having a conversation with them, setting the mandated deadlines in those compliance notices, their understanding of the constraints of gateway 2 funding from various sources, etc., etc. But then counter to that, until, obviously I don't want to be the first one, but until we see some teeth and enforcement, how is that working? You know, have a bit more time. Actually, we're still leaving residents at risk. So I think we're probably still in that bedding in phase, and there's a bit of leniency because of that. I think in 26 we'll see, hang on, you've had enough time now to understand what we expect. Where is it? And we can start that enforcement process and follow it through and see where it lands. The technology is still a struggle. I've got 1 notice in at the moment, submitted it 2 or 3 days before the deadline. They've then come back to me and said, actually, we didn't want it by email. Can you upload your documents to this link? The link came to me on a Friday morning. That's a 7-day link. I've lost 2 days by having a weekend. So still needs some thought around the practicalities of that. I don't think it would impact any enforcement if you've lost that time. But if we do head to a more robust enforcement procedure, I think the timings and the technology is going to become critical to how we submit to BSR in time. In terms of BSR charges, probably the most difficult in particularly in my sector, in leasehold. We've got leaseholder protections, we've got Section 20 consultations for costs, and we've got budgeting. A lot of our team now crazy busy trying to get budgets out the door, and the unknown project cost is what is it going to cost at the end, whether that's for gateway 2 or for your back application. This one I've referred to where we've got contravention notices. we're picking those up now free of charge for the client to avoid any more costs, but it cost £16,000 before they got a refusal. A significant amount of service charge cost when you're also, is that money better spent on safety outcomes for the residents rather than costs spent on the regulator? But in fairness to the regulator, I think that the quality of submissions will be able to reduce that cost significantly for the leaseholders, and that's where competent managing agents, consultants will come in, looking at what you actually need rather than this one-size-fits-all package of we'll sell you every type of survey and still get a refusal. And then just finally, the Grenfell Phase 2 recommendations. I think the big one for 26 are peeps. Again, in my sector, I think there is a huge area of layperson volunteer directors reliant on their agents to do this stuff. And we're now looking at asking them or for the managing agent to produce person-centered risk assessments. I think we need to see a shift in how that's managed. I think we need more support. I've seen some guidance from the regulator aimed at RMCs. We've done a couple of things. There's others out there as well doing, sort of guidance sessions for volunteer directors. But there comes a point where they're volunteers and they're paying for the privilege to have the SR review all of their stuff, and they're probably paying an agent or somebody else to try and get them through it. And it just needs to be a bit more proportionate when it comes to understanding who the actual principal accountable person is.
Perfect. Thank you very much, James. Yeah, no, I'll take that away that 2026 will be the year of enforcement. Let's see if that's the case. On the basis that 2025 there hasn't really been any at all, then yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe that it definitely needs to happen in a proportionate way. But I think there does need to be some consequence, especially for the really sort of bad actors. So thank you for that. So Melisa, we talked fairly recently. We talked about that thorny subject of prohibitions and so decants evacuate. So effectively this number here, the 14345 number, is roughly the latest estimated number of residents that have been removed or asked to leave their homes either by law or by request, but due to have been living in an unsafe building post Grenfell. And this is something else that we track as an organisation from press reporting. But it's roughly the number at the moment of since Grenfell. It's gone up a little bit since we spoke. And we talked about Maslow's hierarchy, the role of a home, in that whole kind of feeling of security and psychological safety, and how Maslow talked about that, and how it's fundamental to our very being, not only having somewhere to live, but also the security that you get from having a home and a roof above your head, and what happens when that's taken away from you. We talked about this sort of concept of a new role in a project team for remediation of this sort of disruption manager, and I think this has moved on a bit now, but that sort of concept of, okay, someone's looking at the risk assessment, someone's looking at the external wall, someone's designing the scheme, someone's doing whatever, but who's actually thinking about the people that are living in the building? Is anybody responsible for those people? Or do you just say resident engagement every 5 minutes and hope that you'll be okay? So it was that actually having an identified role within that project team to say who is managing the people all the way through, who is advocating for the residents, who is thinking about the residents in the way that, for example, in a data protection context, you'd have a privacy impact assessment. If you were about to put CCTV up everywhere, you'd have somebody doing the impact assessment on privacy. Well, where's the impact assessment on people within remediation projects? We talked a lot about this whole sort of point of humanity and how it chimes with our corporate values, etc., but also from what Melisa was saying in terms of this is a human business, and something that was absolutely overlooked, I think, by the government and the regulator when they were incepting, that they kind of really did forget the people that are involved in these buildings, and right through to the how do you react when you get an extra bill in your service charge. That's a human response. You're not dealing with an employer on an oil rig that just says, oh, I could spend $500,000 on a new alarm system. That's unfortunate. It will come off the bottom line, but you know, it's not my money anyway, it's the shareholders' money. Here, that £500,000 is split by the number of leaseholders, and they'll get a demand, service charge demand. We went on for a lot about that, but I really want to get over to Melisa, because I think quite a lot has changed since a couple of months ago in terms of your journey. So do you want to, from the airport there at Heathrow, do you want to bring us into what you think is going to happen over the course of next year?
Thanks, Matt. So one thing that when we first talked, I saw a really big need in supporting the resident well-being, but the reality is that it's really difficult. It's intangible. Not a lot of people have the time or really the knowledge in understanding how to track that or measure that. So what I did was look at, well, I come from the enterprise space. I understand organization have to have, board members, and they have to bring in revenue, etc. So I was looking at how does resident behavior directly impact remediation timelines. And so if you're not engaging, communicating, building trust with residents throughout remediation, whether that's them needing to be evacuated, which is only a small percentage, or them having to stay in their homes while remediation's happening, if you're not properly ensuring that you're doing that the right way and they're maintaining psychological safety, then access refusals and no-shows skyrocket, and that will directly impact your timelines and budgets. And so what's happening with this pivot is we're building resident risk mitigation processes to see how you can actually index and track how the engagement piece up front will directly impact and benefit the programs as they progress. And so I'm really excited about that, because nobody is doing that. And, it's about formalizing that and hopefully building that into a discipline within building safety, because I've seen, I think that the biggest, it's not so much that people don't care about the residents, it's just they don't know how to implement that within their programs. So I want to make it as easy as possible.
That's really good. Thank you. Thank you very much, Melisa. And final one, Simon. So this was last month. As I said, Simon got called away at the last minute due to a family emergency. But we were talking, or I was talking on his behalf, about the public register of HRB. So all higher risk buildings need to be registered with the building safety regulator, and then they appear on a public register, which is pretty much unusable to most people. The only way you can access a building record is to know the exact postcode with which it was registered. If somebody has miskeyed the postcode, or you've got 3 entrances and 3 postcodes and you know 2 of them but you don't know the third, and the third you won't find the building, and lots of the other attributes about the building around sort of where is it on a map, the building name, for example, all of these elements cannot be searched on. So we've managed to effectively get all of the data from the public register and then try and sanitize it and understand it, and that's where I can say with a degree of certainty there's 13,827 unique HRBs in the country, but it's still not perfect, but it's better than it was. There's errors and bad data within that, with duplicate records. There's records that are displaying values in the wrong location. So, for example, in one in particular, if you find that building on its postcode, it will bring back its postcode as its HRB number, for example. So there's various issues within the data set that need to be tidied up. There's a lot of key building information in there, but some of the summary information that we've got is that that's 13,027. Sorry, I've got the wrong number. 13,027 unique HRBs. but within that, there are 1,818 connected blocks. So again, in the way that you register an HRB, and there are a number that I know personally that are incorrectly registered. If you have, for example, 3 towers with a shared car parking level running in the basement levels beneath it with shared escape routes, that is one HRB, one unique HRB under the legislation, but it's 3 connected blocks. So that would count as one of 13,027. But if you just look at the public register, there are far more than 13,027 results, and that's because there's a load of duplicates and also there's a load of connected blocks. So trying to reverse engineer that is quite difficult. And then you've got a number of individual HRBs within the 13,027 that are increasing the number because they should be registered as one connected block. So again, hopefully over time this will get ironed out and improved. There are approximately 5,402 principal accountable persons, unique principal accountable persons as entities. Again, there's a lot of duplication in there because you might have London Borough of Camden, Camden Council, Camden in the data set, but we think they are all the same entity, just poorly entered into the data set or corrupted. We don't know. So that number is probably lower in terms of unique maps. And interestingly, there is just over 1 million residential units in that entire data set. So one of the bits of registration information is how many residential units there are in each of the buildings that are registered. We've totaled all of those and it comes to just over 1 million, which I was quite surprised by. I thought it would be more sort of 2 million plus. So again, how reliable that is, I don't know. And then sitting beyond this, which we haven't got, is all the key building information, which is the far more detailed wall build-up, roof insulation, number of fire doors, all of those things that you've probably all been through, that has to be uploaded beneath these records. But one of the key points we landed on is there is significant questionability, if you like, about how reliable this public register is if you could access it, and what that might mean downstream to people that are trying to make decisions with that data, which I think would include somebody like Simon, where he's looking at risk. So on that point, I will hand over to Simon and hear his thoughts on 2026.
That's a very smooth segue there, Matt. Yeah, I think one of the key things the data tells us is how little understanding there was in establishing a new regulatory regime about the scale and the complexity of the problem. I think there was a real naivety amongst those that established the regulatory regime and originally set up the building safety regulator about how difficult this problem was. I kept hearing statements like, you know, we deal with complex chemical projects, nuclear power stations, and they're really difficult, so we can deal with residential buildings. And I think probably most people on this call will tell you just how difficult and how unique the problem of dealing with residential buildings is. I think James, you and Richard, you both touched on the point that, you know, we have people living in these buildings. Unfortunately, the people create the hazard. They're also part of the management of the hazard. We want them to have a voice in dealing with the problems, as Melisa has said, and that complexity is unique within the built environment. It is a deeply complex problem. But I think also we've kind of failed to really use the data to do any kind of triage properly with what we're dealing with. I think several people have said the disappointment about how much the focus was on new build rather than the legacy estate. Well, guess what? No one's going to die in anything this year that hasn't been built. You know, the hazard sits within the existing estate, and that's really where the focus should be. And I have to say as well, I think we've probably got the focus the wrong way around. We started on the outside of the buildings, which is the most difficult, the most complex, the most troubling and interruptive of all the things you can do, rather than starting with the simple stuff like get the fire doors right, folks, make sure that things like smoke control systems are working and stuff like that, and work up from there. So I think we're still struggling to see a regulatory process that is learning from its mistakes. You know, we're just talking now about adding more numbers to this to change the HRB number without fixing the problems we've got. We keep bringing new guidance out and making things more complicated without necessarily fixing where we are. So, you know, I don't want to see a pause in what we're doing, because it's so encouraging to hear people who are working on the legacy estate on this call talking about doing stuff. And to be honest, most of the legacy estate people have got on with it, done it quietly. And we have seen the sea change in a huge number of organizations culturally about how they're dealing with fire safety. That's fantastic. It absolutely should be applauded. But they haven't been the squeaky wheel that's drawn the attention of government and of the regulator. Because you guys have kind of just got on with it and dealt with it because you know it's the right thing to do, unfortunately, it means the process isn't being fixed. So I would like to see some kind of recognition of that in 2026. We don't want to pause because we want to keep moving forward, but I do think we need to start using the data and triaging a bit better. Rather than just taking the next one off the rack that came in the order it came in, we really do need to start triaging buildings. And we can see the challenges that come from if you don't do that. I mean, if you take the Spectrum building, it's only just over the 18 meters, and yet we added to the hazard of that building, because there seems to be a real failure of understanding that the cladding buildings and scaffolding and doing works on them isn't a temporary situation. You know, it takes years. This is into the permanence of buildings. You know, this really should be treated as permanent works and properly regulated and properly looked at. But in a rush to get on and do certain very difficult things, we've kind of missed out on doing some of the really important simple things that genuinely will make people safer. But I suspect that people like James and Richard and Steve are actually getting on and doing that in real life behind the scenes. But I don't think the regulator is celebrating that. I don't think the regulator is bringing out the best practice in that and holding it up as examples. So I'd like to see more of that. I'd like to see the regulator recognise what's really being done at grassroots level and talking about that as good practice, and maybe trying to shift the focus to the stuff that really matters.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, and it's one of the things we talked about in terms of the use of data, and one of the things we were going to talk about was the fact that, you know, at the moment when it comes to the occupation phase, until you, apart from uploading key building information and registering a building, the regulator knows nothing about your behaviour until such time as you get called forward for a back application. So it's very real that there are people out there that maybe have a whole load of buildings that are in what would have been tranche 4 or 5 or whatever, are just completely ignoring all of this legislation until such time as they think, well, that's years away for us. We'll think about the Building Safety Act then. So now, I'm not saying it did because we don't know, but Spectrum could have been in that situation where nobody really cared about their PAP duties or whatever, because they're only just over 18 meters. They're not going to get called forward forever in their perception. So again, there is very little digital oversight of behaviour. You know, I think to my mind, if you're constantly uploading and replacing your safety case report, for example, on the portal, it would be very easy to see the PAPs that are continuously engaging and those that have been invited and have never bothered to turn up, you know, just as a simple data point. But no, interesting stuff. And
I mean, speaking as someone who was involved in the design of many buildings over the years, you know, you kind of get a sense that the really big tool stuff, the stuff that draws attention, funnily enough, gets a lot of attention paid to it when it's designed and managed. The really low-rise stuff and the mid-rise stuff and the stuff that just sneaks over a sort of thresholds and the such like does tend to sort of fall into the, well, we'll go to a second tier contractor, well, we're going to try and cheapify it by splitting all the packages up. And you could see that in the construction process, and you kind of go, that information and that knowledge should tell you where the bulk of things that probably got problems and need fixing are, and they're probably not in the glamour end of the market, just put it that way, you know. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Well, I'm going to flip into some questions now. I've got a few up on the screen, so I'm just picking them out. Apologies if I miss anyone. So the first one is, what relevance does uncontrolled when printed have in the golden thread? Many electronic document management systems don't cope well with this kind of thing, and the answer doesn't lie in BIM. My thought on that is that in relation to the regulator, they are judging you on your submission. So by the very nature of the fact they're calling for a document, you've effectively printed it. That is your best work at the time that you submit it. It's not really so I think, unless I've misinterpreted the question, unless anyone on the panel want to jump in on that particular point. But It is a requirement to, and it is laid down in law that you are submitting documents. Simon, you've got your hand up.
I was just going to say, it's interesting that the comment there about BIM, because I think originally within the regulator, there was a bit of a premise that BIM was going to be the great white hope here, that this was going to solve everything. But I think, you know, anybody who talks to anybody on the ground will tell you that's a long way off in the future, even for new buildings that are being designed today, let alone how you're going to deal with the legacy buildings. And there was a lot of focus put onto BIM as being some kind of answer, rather than this other problem of uncontrollable imprinted, etc., and stuff like that. So I think there was a regulatory failing or setting up of the regulator that kind of glossed over that, thinking that BIM could do everything, and it clearly can't in legacy buildings.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, Lucy, just conscious of time. So Lucy's mentioned that we're still finding blocks that have never been registered. Absolutely, there is. I think that points. I think Steve's mentioned it. I think the level of understanding across the industry of what do we own, what do we manage, what height is it, still debates over height measurements and interpretation of one that we've got ongoing at the moment, the interpretation of a mezzanine floor, where the freeholder's surveyor says it's a story, the managing agent and us are saying no, it's not, and then you look at the guidance, and there's guidance and legislation that's conflicting. So probably going to end up in the first tier tribunal for an adjudication, you know, roof terraces. So for all of those buildings that are on the borderline, but what we do know is that probably that 4-story building, well, I've got one on our books at the moment, it's 4 stories above a Prezzo restaurant, 2 flats per floor, it's 15.2 meters, 18.2 meters in height, 5 stories, 8 flats, it's an HRB. We can all think that's really stupid, but that's where the line is. So it wouldn't surprise me at all if we find a lot more HRBs coming out of the woodwork. And to Simon's point, that's before we consider changing the boundary or the description. So Dom's asked, is there a way to prevent people applying, knowing that the application will be rejected just to postpone? Is the consequence of this? I'm guessing that's based on back. Because if gateway 2, you'd be shooting yourself in the foot at that point. So if it's back, well, probably James is probably the best place to answer what happens, what the consequences are for getting a rejection. But again, you will be effectively just wasting your own money, because they will take you on a long journey before they reject you, rather than just rejecting you overnight, as far as I'm aware, James.
So obviously we know that you can't apply for a back until you're invited. So that works out from the tranches. Once you are invited, you've got that 28 days. There's an offence committed right away if you don't submit. But in theory, yes, you could submit some terrible work, but you'd be in charge of £151 an hour for all of those RFIs. Then you'll get contravention notices because you failed. You have to display your back in the building, and you have to work through the contraventions before they'll invite you to reapply.
Yeah, so it's a lot of time and money. But yeah, I suppose if you weren't ready and you get the 28-day call up, then I suppose you would just have to try and put something in, because they'll just initially be looking at, have you uploaded those 3 documents? They're not telling you at that point whether they're good, bad, or indifferent. But
it's just shifting the liability to a different PAC duty. So you might meet the requirement to submit a safety case report when requested, but you failed on the management of risks and everything else. So you're just shifting the offence across part 4, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. Well, we've overrun, so apologies everybody, but I know it was probably a bit over ambitious to try and bring as many people in and do this all within an hour. So quickly moving on, apart from thanking everybody for coming, and is to say that we are going to carry on in 2026. The next one will be on the 5th of February, so we'll send out invitations. We want to wish everybody a happy new year and a safe Christmas and all that sort of stuff. And please keep involved in the conversation. If you'd like to come on as an expert, please let me know. We'll try and get to the questions afterwards. I know we've run out of time, so that's on me as the chair. And please do follow us on social media channels, and just tell us what you like, good, bad, or indifferent. Wishing everybody a wonderful Christmas. and we'll see you all back in February safe and sound. And thank you to all my expert guests for coming and helping me out today. So thank you all.